I'll tread carefully here, but I won't sugarcoat it. In tough times, people look for an easy answer, a safety net that they can count on. And for many, right now, that's the so-called great wealth transfer. The idea that the silent Gen and boomers will hand down trillions of dollars to Gen X, Millennials, even Gen Zs. Yet so far, only 1 in 5 have received any inheritance. And after discounting the wealthiest 10%, the median inheritance for the remaining 90,000 is close to zero. And whether that stat is correct or not, there are many reasons that inheritance may never make it to you. Before I dive into this list, I realize the weight of what I'm talking about here. Unless someone gifts you some money before they die, which is not what I'm talking about here, to receive an inheritance means that someone has passed on. And while what they leave behind may be useful, even a blessing, we can't overlook the loss that comes with it. And no matter how you feel about the person in that relationship, the first thing you have to do is honor and respect the life that was lived. And the first way that inheritance may never make it to you is that healthcare eats it first. Medical bills can drain savings faster than anything. Surgeries, prescriptions, hospital stays, they all add up fast. Medicare does help, but it's only covering 80% of approved charges. And there's a long list of things it doesn't cover. Maybe they need daily help with activities at home, not covered. Dental care, not covered. Eye exams, glasses, hearing aids, not covered either. Here's an example. Your parent falls and breaks a hip. They go to the hospital, they have surgery, they stay a few days, they get transferred to a rehab facility. Medicare will cover the first 20 days. But after that, there's a copay. Currently, I believe that's around $204 a day. So unless they have some kind of supplemental insurance, that's coming out of their savings. Now think about a couple, living into their 80s, maybe even their 90s. They're not just going to the doctor once or twice a year. They're likely to have repeat hospital visits, prescriptions, specialists, and each of those events, chip away at their savings. The bottom line is that healthcare costs are one of the fastest ways an inheritance gets eaten before it gets to you. And the second reason is longer lifespans. Parents and grandparents, they're living a lot longer than previous generations. On paper, life expectancy is still averaging between 75 and 80 years old, but most of us can think really quickly of a family member that's lived into their 80s or 90s. And every extra year lived is extra expense. It's easy to assume that people at that age, they just stop spending. But that's not true. They may not be traveling as much or buying new wardrobes, but the everyday costs don't go away. Housing and utilities and groceries, those bills keep coming. Add in extra services like, lawn care or a handyman, cleaning help, even a part-time caregiver. And the expenses keep coming. And then there's the big ticket items like house modifications, like, adding ramps or stair lifts or remodeling the bathroom. These aren't really luxuries, they're necessities at that age. But they cost money, and that money usually comes out of, retirement accounts and savings. Every year that someone lives longer than expected, those assets are being used for survival, not for leaving behind. The third reason is long-term care in nursing homes. Oh, this is the topic nobody wants to talk about, especially the person it involves. But the truth is, as we start getting older, the choices and the options, they start dwindling. And I've even heard heartbreaking stories of adult children having to trick their parent into getting them into a long-term care facility because there was simply no other choice. But let's set emotions aside for just a second and talk about the money, because that's what this video today is really about. the median cost of an assisted living facility. And keep in mind, a person has to be fairly, mobile and somewhat, independent to qualify to live in an assisted living facility. But those are around $5,200 a month. That's over $60,000 a year. And that number doesn't include every fee and add-on and other, daily needs that they might want. Now, let's say your loved one needs memory care or a skilled nursing facility. You're looking at closer to $10,000 a month, over $100,000 a year. And yeah, that's usually for a semi-private room, with a roommate. And here's the kicker, Medicaid, it won't cover assisted living at all. Now, it will cover nursing home care, but only after your loved one has basically spent it all, drained their savings, bankrupted themselves first. And even after Medicaid pays for long-term care, and remember, I'm saying Medicaid, not Medicare, because Medicare doesn't cover any long-term care costs. But even after Medicaid has paid for this long-term care, the state can file a claim against the estate to recoup, any other costs. That could mean that the house or other assets would have to be sold upon their death in order to pay the state back. And this is one of the biggest wild cards in retirement planning. None of us know whether we'll need long-term care. And if we do, it's almost impossible to fully prepare for, emotionally and financially. And that's why it can wipe out an inheritance faster than anything else. So for your loved one, how do you avoid or prolong the need for long-term care? Well, you step in and become their caregiver. Whether this means you moving in with them or vice versa, whether this means you may have to quit your job or take a reduction in hours, or whether it means you hire a part-time caregiver to help when you can't. And I hate to put it in insensitive terms, but you may find yourself working for that inheritance. The word caregiving itself can sound precious and selfless and loving, but it could be the hardest thing you'll ever find yourself doing. Okay, the fourth reason is scams, financial missteps, and cognitive decline. Scams, elder fraud, it's exploding. Phone scams, fake investments, billions vanish every year. And here's the scary part. It only takes one mistake to drain an estate. Sometimes it's as simple as a weak password that gets leaked. Or maybe your parent still writes checks and gets defrauded that way. It doesn't stop there. There's tax fraud, title theft, where someone, forges a deed, transfers the house into their name and then starts taking home equity loans out on it. And while some may get restitution from the bank or law enforcement, let's be honest, that's rare. Most of the time, once the money's gone, it's gone. Maybe you have a loved one that doesn't trust banks and literally sticks everything they have, under the mattress. You may think I'm kidding. I'm not. If that home gets broken into or burns down, it's all gone. And there's no getting it back. Shady financial advisors could easily convince someone to move their money into horrible investments. And although it may not be an outright scam, it's still predatory. And while scams and predators, they come from the outside, cognitive decline makes people vulnerable from the inside. And I don't think I need to elaborate too much on how someone with cognitive decline could decimate their life savings. One foul decision could have them selling off all their assets or signing away their rights to, everything they own. And let's get to the fifth reason, debts and liabilities. I want to talk about this one because I don't think everyone is clear on this one. I wasn't. The executor or the administrator of the estate, they must use the deceased's assets to pay any outstanding debts before distributing inheritances. If the mortgage is still unpaid or there are home equity loans, whoever inherits that property or that asset, they're still responsible for making those payments or risk foreclosure. This also pertains to cars or other pieces of property. If there's a business involved, many times those debts are settled with the estate as well. It's not uncommon at all for the outstanding debts to exceed the value of the deceased person's estate. And if you're not fully aware of this person's finances, this could be a bad surprise after their passing. And while you can't correct a lifetime of bad money management, proactively you can be there for them as they age to offer, solutions for them. And just remember that heirs, they don't inherit assets. They inherit what's left after debts. And the sixth reason is maybe they have other plans or other ideas. Okay, I'm glad you're still watching because this one is the most controversial one on the list. Are you certain that you know what their wishes truly are? Or are you just assuming? Family dynamics change all the time. Remarriages, blended families, estrangement. We all know this is common, right? When parents remarry and one passes away, the surviving new spouse can inherit it all and not leave anything for the children of the first marriage. What about just mistakenly not being listed as a beneficiary on their account? This one is all too common. Those beneficiary forms could have been completed 50 years ago or more. Is that person on that form, is it still correct? Or are they even still alive? Maybe there's no will. Statistics say that boomers, less than half of them have a will. And in that case, the state will decide who gets what, which may not align at all with your expectations. Being the next of kin doesn't guarantee that Uncle Jim and Aunt Barbara are leaving it all to you. They may have in mind that a religious organization or a animal rescue is the better decision. What I'm trying to convey in this point is that it's never safe to assume what the wishes of others are. And then you can either be pleasantly surprised at the eventual outcome or only mildly disappointed if it goes another way. I know this is a sensitive topic, and to be real, I almost didn't make this video because of that. But I just kept reading all of these articles hyping up the great wealth transfer and how so many younger people, are depending on it like it's a sure thing. So if you stand to inherit money or property from a loved one, your mission is clear. Proactive engagement and clear communication. And even when the wishes are known and the net worth of a loved one is known, and you're going to be that recipient, as you can see from the points I've discussed here, counting on an inheritance isn't a sound strategy. It's a gamble. I would love to hear in the comments your thoughts on this topic. Share your stories and your experiences, and share this video with those you feel could benefit from this information. It's a reality check we probably don't want, but being unaware of the possibilities that can happen, that's not where we want to be either. Check out this video next. The money lies that Gen X needs to unlearn before it's too late. Just click right here. Stay aware, stay resilient, and take care of yourself out there. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.